This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Some people think heroes arrive with sirens and flashing lights. But sometimes, they arrive carrying a tray of pizza. On a warm Friday evening in downtown Chicago, Riverside Grill hummed with the quiet rhythm of a full house. Plates clinked. Soft jazz floated through the air. Outside, the late summer breeze rolled down the river, warm and steady, like the city itself refusing to slow down. Inside, 8-year-old Lucas Whitmore swung his legs under the booth, his sneakers barely touching the polished wooden floor. He had a glass of apple juice in front of him and a slice of pepperoni pizza that was far too big for his small hands. Across the table sat his father, Daniel Whitmore, a man most people in the financial world described with words like powerful, calculating, and unstoppable. At 39, Daniel had built a tech empire worth billions of dollars, appeared on magazine covers, and spoken at conferences where entire rooms of executives leaned forward just to hear him finish a sentence. But right now, he wasn't thinking about board meetings or stock prices. He was watching his son attempt to fold a slice of pizza like he'd seen on YouTube. "Careful," Daniel said with a small smile. "That thing weighs at least 2 pounds. Lucas grinned. "Dad, pizza doesn't weigh 2 pounds. In Chicago, it might." Lucas laughed, the kind of laugh that made nearby diners glance over with quiet smiles. It had been a long week for Daniel. Investor calls, product launches, the constant pressure of a company that never really slept. Tonight was supposed to be simple. Just dinner with his son. No bodyguards hovering too close. No executives interrupting the evening. Just pizza, apple juice, and a promise he'd made earlier that day. "Can we do something normal tonight?" Lucas had asked. Daniel had said yes before the boy finished the sentence. Across the dining room, Emily Carter balanced 3 plates on one arm as she moved between tables with the easy rhythm of someone who had done this thousands of times. 26 years old, honey brown hair tied into a simple ponytail, and the kind of calm presence that made customers instinctively trust her. Emily had worked at Riverside Grill for 2 years, long enough to recognize every type of diner who walked through the door. The quiet couples, the loud office parties, the exhausted parents with hungry kids, and occasionally, the ones who arrived already a little too loud. She set a plate down at table 12 and smiled politely as the group there continued debating baseball statistics. Then she turned toward the kitchen, grabbing a tray of fresh drinks along the way. Halfway across the room, she noticed the man near the bar. Tall, expensive suit jacket draped over his shoulder, and the unmistakable sway of someone who had enjoyed one drink too many. Emily sighed quietly under her breath. Not angry, just tired in the way service workers sometimes get when they can already see where a situation might go. The man stumbled a step sideways, catching himself on the edge of a table. A couple nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Emily continued walking, her expression neutral. She'd learned something important working here. Panic made things worse. Calm usually made them better. At the Whitmore booth, Lucas had finally managed to fold his pizza slice in half. "See," he said proudly. "Perfect engineering." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Careful. If my engineers hear you say that, they might offer you a job." Lucas laughed again, taking a triumphant bite. A few feet away, the unsteady man turned suddenly, bumping into a passing chair. The chair scraped loudly across the floor. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Emily noticed immediately. Her steps slowed just slightly as she adjusted the tray in her hand. Not rushing, just paying attention. The man muttered something under his breath and looked around the room with a confused frown, as if the entire restaurant had somehow moved while he wasn't looking. Lucas glanced over curiously. "Dad?" he whispered, leaning closer. "That man smells like gasoline." Daniel blinked, surprised by the comment, then looked in the same direction. The man near the bar was now walking unevenly through the aisle between tables, his expression tight with irritation. For a moment, the entire dining room felt a little quieter. Not silent, just aware. Emily set the tray down gently on the nearest service counter. She wiped her hands on a small cloth and took one calm breath. "Not again," she murmured softly. Then she stepped forward. Emily Carter moved with steady steps across the dining room, not fast enough to cause alarm, not slow enough to ignore what was happening. Years of working crowded dinner shifts had taught her one simple rule. If someone entered a room already upset, the best response was calm. Real calm. The kind that lowered the temperature without anyone noticing how it happened. The man near the bar straightened suddenly and looked around as if he had just remembered he was not alone. His jacket hung loosely from one shoulder, and his tie was half pulled loose, the polished confidence of earlier in the evening replaced by something irritated and restless. He took another step forward, and his elbow brushed the edge of a nearby table. A glass rattled but did not fall. A couple seated there leaned back in their chairs. Emily noticed the small details the way she always did. The unsteady feet, the flushed face, the slightly louder voice than necessary. None of it unusual for a Friday night. But sometimes the difference between a quiet evening and a long one could be measured in seconds. At the Whitmore booth, Lucas was still studying his pizza like it was a science experiment. "Dad," he said quietly, "do you think astronauts eat pizza in space?" Daniel Whitmore smiled faintly. "I am fairly certain they do not fold it like that." Lucas looked proud. "They should." Daniel leaned back slightly in the booth and allowed himself a rare moment of quiet observation. The restaurant was warm and comfortable, the low lighting reflecting gently off polished wood tables and brass fixtures. This place had a kind of relaxed confidence he appreciated. No one here seemed overly impressed by money or status. In a city where every dinner could turn into a networking opportunity, Riverside Grill felt almost refreshingly normal. A chair scraped again somewhere behind them. Lucas turned his head. The man from the bar was now walking between tables, his steps uneven but determined. Daniel noticed immediately. Years of building companies had sharpened his instinct for reading rooms. Tension, even the subtle kind, rarely escaped him. The man stopped briefly beside a table where a family was finishing dessert. He stared down at the plates as if trying to remember why he had walked there. Then he turned again, moving toward the center aisle. Conversations lowered slightly around him. Not silent, just cautious. Emily reached the aisle a few seconds before he did. She positioned herself near a service station, one hand resting lightly on the counter as she observed him approach. Her expression remained neutral, almost relaxed. The goal was simple. Let the situation settle before it turned into something larger. Sometimes all it took was a quiet presence. The man glanced around the room and finally noticed Lucas at the booth nearby. The boy was still swinging his legs under the table, humming softly while he folded his napkin into a triangle. The man frowned slightly, as though the small movement had caught his attention. He stepped closer to the booth. Daniel's posture shifted instantly. Not aggressive, not alarmed, just alert. The man gestured vaguely toward the table and muttered something about a spilled drink that had never actually happened. Lucas blinked in confusion, looking down at his untouched glass of apple juice. "I did not spill anything," Lucas said politely. The man leaned a little closer, squinting as if examining evidence that was not there. A few diners nearby watched quietly now. Emily had already started walking toward them. Her steps were measured, unhurried, but purposeful. She had seen situations like this before. A misunderstanding mixed with too much alcohol could create unnecessary tension in a matter of seconds. The key was to interrupt the moment before emotions decided to do the talking. Lucas looked up again, uncertain but not frightened. Daniel placed a calm hand on the table near his son's plate, ready to step in if necessary. The man opened his mouth to continue complaining, his voice beginning to rise just slightly above the comfortable hum of the dining room. That was the moment Emily arrived. She stepped smoothly between the edge of the booth and the aisle, her posture relaxed but steady. "Good evening, sir," she said gently, her voice clear but calm enough that the surrounding tables did not feel startled. The man turned his attention toward her, momentarily distracted. Emily offered a small professional smile, the same one she had used with hundreds of customers before him. "Is there something I can help you with tonight?" For a brief second the tension paused, like a ripple in water settling before it spread further across the room. Daniel watched carefully now. Lucas looked from the man to Emily, curious rather than afraid. The man blinked slowly, as though trying to decide whether he was annoyed or simply confused. Emily remained exactly where she stood, calm, patient, and completely unshaken. Sometimes the most powerful move in a crowded room was the simplest one. Someone stepping forward and quietly saying, "Let us slow this down." The man stared at Emily Carter for a moment, as if her calm voice had interrupted a thought he had not finished forming. His eyes moved from her face to the booth and then back again, the irritation in his expression searching for somewhere to land. Around them, the restaurant remained quiet, the low hum of conversations returning slowly but cautiously as people pretended not to watch. Emily kept her posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the booth so that she was standing just slightly between the aisle and the small space where Lucas Whitmore sat. It was not an obvious gesture. It was simply practical, the kind of movement someone made without thinking when protecting a little extra space. This kid, the man said slowly, gesturing vaguely toward Lucas, spilled something earlier. Lucas blinked in confusion again and looked down at the table as though trying to see the invisible accident being described. His glass of apple juice stood untouched beside his pizza plate. A single napkin triangle rested neatly next to it. "Sir," Emily said gently, her tone friendly but steady. "I have been working this section all evening, and I did not see any spills here." Her voice carried just enough confidence to settle the air. The man frowned, clearly unsure whether to continue the complaint or reconsider the moment entirely. Daniel Whitmore watched closely now, his attention fully focused on the waitress standing calmly in front of them. Most people who spoke to upset customers either rushed their words or tried too hard to apologize. Emily did neither. She simply stood there, composed, as if patience itself was part of the job. Lucas leaned slightly toward his father and whispered quietly, "Dad, I think she is the manager." Daniel almost smiled but did not answer yet. The man shifted his weight again and looked down at Lucas. The boy met his gaze with the polite seriousness children sometimes use when speaking to adults they do not fully understand. "I really did not spill anything," Lucas said softly. Emily nodded once as if confirming the statement. "I believe him," she said, still calm. The man opened his mouth again, searching for words that now seemed harder to organize. Emily continued before the tension could grow. "But if something was spilled earlier tonight, we will gladly bring you another drink or help clean it up. That is what we are here for." The simplicity of the offer seemed to slow the moment even further. A few nearby diners returned to their meals, sensing the situation drifting away from conflict. The man glanced toward the bar area, then back toward Emily. The certainty that had fueled his complaint a few seconds earlier had begun to fade. Alcohol had a way of magnifying small annoyances and then quietly abandoning them when attention shifted. Emily waited patiently, not pushing, not retreating, just present, had simply stepped forward when something needed to be handled, and then calmly returned the room to normal. Lucas leaned forward excitedly. "Do superheroes serve dessert too?" he asked. Emily tilted her head thoughtfully, as if considering the question very seriously. "Only on special occasions," she replied. Lucas pointed proudly at his plate. "It is my birthday." Emily's eyes widened slightly with genuine surprise. "Well then," she said with a small grin, "that definitely qualifies as a special occasion." Daniel watched the exchange quietly, realizing something he did not expect. In a room full of expensive suits, quiet deals, and carefully managed reputations, the calmest person present had been the waitress who carried the pizza. Emily Carter rested her hand lightly against the back of the booth for another moment, making sure the room had truly returned to its normal rhythm. The quiet conversations had resumed, forks tapped gently against plates again, and the soft jazz music from the ceiling speakers slowly reclaimed the atmosphere of the restaurant. Moments like that often pass quickly, but experienced servers always gave the room a few seconds to breathe afterward. Lucas Whitmore watched her with open admiration, his pizza temporarily forgotten. "So do superheroes get cake?" he asked again, leaning forward with bright curiosity. Emily placed a hand thoughtfully under her chin as if the question required serious analysis. "Well," she said slowly, "superheroes do need energy to keep saving the day." "Highlight of the evening," he said. Lucas nodded enthusiastically in confirmation. Emily laughed softly and stepped back from the booth. "Then I will speak with the kitchen," she said. "Give me just a few minutes." Lucas watched her walk away as though she had just been promoted to the most important person in the building. Small circle of candlelight on the table. When he opened his eyes again, the candle was out, and the smile on his face could have powered the entire building. "Thank you," Lucas said. Emily gave a small nod as if the gratitude belonged entirely to the occasion. Daniel reached for his wallet almost automatically, but paused before pulling anything out. Instead, he looked up at her with quiet curiosity. "You handled that situation earlier with remarkable calm," he said. "Customer, nodded politely, and wrote something down on her small order pad. Nothing about her movements suggested she had just handled an uncomfortable situation minutes earlier. She simply continued working as though calm problem-solving was part of the routine. I think she probably does what needs to be done, Daniel replied thoughtfully. Lucas considered that answer while finishing another bite of cake. At Daniel, Dad meets people like that too, he said proudly. He runs a big company. Emily glanced briefly at Daniel with polite interest, but did not show the usual reaction Daniel often saw when people learned who he was. One table felt different. Is like a superpower. Emily laughed quietly. If it is, then I guess everyone should practice it. Daniel listened to the exchange with quiet attention. Most people avoided questions from children because they required honest answers. Emily seemed comfortable with them. Lucas leaned forward again. Dad says calm people are the smartest in the room. Emily raised an eyebrow toward Daniel with playful curiosity. Is that true? Daniel shrugged lightly. It is often a useful strategy. Emily considered that for a second and then nodded once as if she approved of the philosophy. The restaurant lights reflected softly in the windows beside their booth. Outside, the Chicago River moved slowly beneath the evening skyline, the glow of city lights stretching across the water like quiet reflections of the busy world above. Inside Riverside Grill, the atmosphere had returned fully to its comfortable rhythm. Plates moved in and out of the kitchen, laughter drifted between tables, and the earlier moment of tension felt like something that had happened hours ago instead of minutes. Emily checked the empty cake plate and smiled. Looks like the birthday mission was successful. Lucas held up his fork proudly. 10 out of 10. Daniel reached for the bill folder resting near the edge of the table. Emily noticed the motion but did not react the way some servers might. She simply waited calmly as Daniel opened the folder and glanced at the receipt. He paused briefly, then looked up at her again. Thank you for handling things earlier, he said quietly. Emily gave a small shrug as if the gratitude was unnecessary. That is part of the job. Daniel shook his head slightly. Not everyone would have handled it that well. For a moment, Emily seemed unsure how to respond. Compliments from strangers were common in restaurants, but this one felt different. It carried genuine observation instead of casual politeness. Well, she said after a second, I am glad the evening turned out well. Lucas leaned forward again, clearly unwilling to let the conversation end yet. Are you working tomorrow? He asked. Emily blinked in surprise at the question and then laughed softly. Yes, most likely. Lucas looked at Daniel with a hopeful expression that only children could create so quickly. Daniel noticed it immediately. He closed the bill folder slowly, his mind considering something he had not planned when the evening began. For reasons he could not fully explain, the calm waitress who carried birthday cake and quiet confidence had made a stronger impression than most people he met in boardrooms twice the size of this restaurant. And Daniel Whitmore was not a man who ignored interesting impressions. Daniel Whitmore kept the bill folder closed in his hands for a moment longer than necessary. The restaurant continued moving around them with its familiar evening rhythm, but his attention remained on the quiet waitress standing beside the table. Lucas watched his father with curiosity, sensing that something was about to happen. Children often noticed the smallest pauses adults made. Emily Carter waited politely, assuming the moment was simply about finishing the payment and letting the guests continue their evening. That was usually how dinners ended. A polite thank you, a quick signature, and the soft scrape of chairs as people left for the night. But Daniel Whitmore rarely made decisions quickly without a reason. He had spent his entire career recognizing moments that deserved a second look. And tonight had offered one of those moments. Lucas leaned forward slightly in the booth and whispered to his father, although not quietly enough to go unnoticed. Ask her, he said. Daniel glanced at him with mild amusement. Ask her what? Lucas looked at Emily again, then back to his father. If she can come to my next birthday. Emily laughed softly, unsure whether the comment was meant seriously or simply as part of the child's playful imagination. Daniel placed the bill folder on the table and finally looked up at her directly. Lucas seems to have decided you are responsible for making this birthday successful, he said calmly. Emily smiled. He made it successful himself, she replied. All I did was bring cake. Lucas shook his head with dramatic disagreement. No, you stopped the weird guy and brought cake. Daniel could not help smiling at the blunt honesty. Emily shrugged lightly as if the earlier moment had already faded from importance. Sometimes restaurants come with unexpected moments, she said. Daniel nodded slowly, studying her expression again. She still seemed completely unaware of how unusual her calm confidence had been earlier. Or perhaps she simply did not see it as unusual at all. Daniel opened the bill folder, placed his card inside, and slid it toward the edge of the table. Emily picked it up with a polite nod and stepped away to process the payment. Lucas watched her walk toward the front counter again. "Dad," he said quietly, "she is different." Daniel leaned back in the booth, folding his hands together as he considered the comment. Different how? Lucas thought carefully, searching for the right words. She talks like she knows things, but she does not try to show off. Daniel looked across the dining room again as Emily handed the card to the cashier near the register. The boy had unintentionally described the same thing Daniel had noticed. Confidence without performance. A rare quality in almost any profession. A minute later, Emily returned to the table with the receipt and placed it gently in front of Daniel. "Thank you for celebrating with us tonight," she said warmly. Daniel signed the receipt and closed the folder again before sliding it back toward her. "Thank you for making the evening memorable," he replied. Emily accepted the folder politely and glanced down briefly before looking back up again. For the first time that evening, her calm expression showed a hint of surprise. The tip written on the receipt was far larger than the usual amount left on a family dinner bill. She looked at Daniel again with mild confusion. "Sir, this is very generous," she said carefully. Daniel shrugged lightly, as if the amount did not require explanation. "Consider it appreciation for excellent service." Emily hesitated. Many servers would have accepted the tip immediately without question. But something about the situation made her pause. "I appreciate that," she said slowly. "But it is much more than necessary." Daniel noticed the sincerity in her voice. She was not pretending to refuse out of politeness. She genuinely meant it. Lucas leaned forward again, clearly enjoying the unfolding conversation. "See," he said proudly, "superheroes do not take big rewards." Emily laughed quietly again and looked down at the receipt once more before placing it carefully back inside the folder. "Then maybe we will call it birthday generosity," she said. Daniel nodded slightly. "That works too." Emily tucked the folder under her arm and gave a small nod toward Lucas. "Happy birthday again," she said. Lucas grinned. "Thank you." For a moment it seemed like the evening had reached its natural ending. Emily turned slightly as if preparing to continue her shift, but Lucas suddenly spoke again before she could step away. "Wait," he said quickly. Emily turned back. "Yes." Lucas looked at Daniel with hopeful determination. "Dad was going to ask you something." Daniel raised an eyebrow at his son. "Was I?" Lucas nodded with absolute confidence. "Yes, because tomorrow is Saturday." Emily looked between them with growing curiosity, wondering what kind of question required this much build-up. Daniel exhaled softly, realizing that sometimes the simplest questions were the most difficult to plan. And tonight had clearly become one of those moments. Emily Carter paused beside the Whitmore booth, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table as she waited for Daniel Whitmore to finish whatever thought Lucas had just volunteered for him. The restaurant continued moving around them with its gentle evening rhythm, but the small circle of space around the booth felt momentarily still. Lucas looked very pleased with himself, as if he had just pushed an important story forward. Daniel exhaled slowly and leaned back in the booth again, glancing at his son before turning his attention back to Emily. "Apparently," Daniel said calmly, "my son believes I was about to ask you a question." Emily folded her hands lightly in front of her apron and tilted her head with polite curiosity. "Children do have a way of volunteering information," she said with a small smile. Lucas sat up straighter, determined not to lose momentum. "It is a good question," he insisted. Daniel gave him a patient look that suggested the conversation had already escaped his original control. Then he returned his attention to Emily. "Lucas mentioned tomorrow is Saturday," Daniel said. Emily nodded slightly. "Yes, usually one of the busier shifts." Daniel tapped his fingers lightly on the table, as if considering his words. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation, asking a simple personal question suddenly felt unusually deliberate. "I was wondering," he said finally, "whether you ever get a day off." Emily blinked once in mild surprise. It was not the question she expected. "Occasionally," she answered honestly. "Usually Mondays." Lucas leaned forward again immediately. That means tomorrow she is working, he said to Daniel with the confidence of someone solving a puzzle. Emily laughed softly at the boy's determination. That is correct. Daniel watched her expression carefully. There was still that same calm presence he had noticed earlier, but now there was also a quiet curiosity about where the conversation might be going. Then I suppose tomorrow will remain a work day, Daniel said thoughtfully. Lucas frowned slightly, as if the answer had not matched the hopeful plan forming in his head. But Dad, he said, you were going to ask something else. Emily looked between them again, clearly entertained by the unusual negotiation happening at the table. Daniel finally shook his head with quiet amusement. All right, he said, turning back to her. Let me try that again. Lucas relaxed immediately, satisfied that progress had resumed. Daniel rested one arm on the table and spoke with the same calm tone he used during important meetings, although the subject was far simpler than most negotiations he handled. Lucas and I try to spend Saturdays doing something normal, he explained. Museums, parks, sometimes just exploring the city. Emily listened politely, unsure where the explanation was heading, but finding the honesty refreshing. Daniel continued. And tonight he seems convinced that the person who made his birthday memorable should be invited to one of those outings. Emily raised her eyebrows slightly, surprised by the suggestion but not uncomfortable. Lucas nodded enthusiastically beside his father. Exactly, he said. Because superheroes should take breaks too. Emily could not help laughing again, the sound light and genuine. That is a very thoughtful invitation, she said carefully. Daniel watched her reaction closely. He had no interest in making the situation awkward or inappropriate. The suggestion was simple, honest, and perhaps a little unusual. It would only be if you were interested, he added calmly. No pressure at all. Emily considered the idea for a moment. In her years working at the restaurant, she had received plenty of invitations from customers, most of them careless or awkward. This one felt different. There was no arrogance in Daniel's tone, no expectation that she would immediately agree. Just a quiet offer presented with respect. Lucas waited with visible anticipation, his elbows now resting on the table. We usually go to the Science Museum, he said helpfully. They have a giant dinosaur skeleton. Emily smiled at the image. That does sound impressive. Daniel leaned back slightly again, giving her space to think. Around them, the restaurant carried on with its evening routine, waiters passing between tables and laughter drifting from the far side of the room. Yet the small conversation at the booth had created its own quiet pause in the middle of it all. Emily finally crossed her arms lightly, not in refusal, but in thought. I appreciate the invitation, she said slowly. Lucas held his breath as if waiting for the verdict of an important decision. Emily looked at him first, then back at Daniel. But tomorrow I will be here most of the day, she continued. Lucas's shoulders dropped slightly, the way children react when plans shift unexpectedly. Daniel nodded once with complete understanding. Of course, he said calmly. Work comes first. Emily noticed the absence of disappointment in his voice. He simply accepted the answer. For a moment, she studied both of them again. The determined boy and the calm father who seemed surprisingly comfortable with ordinary moments. Then she spoke again before either of them could end the conversation. However, she added thoughtfully, Mondays are usually quieter for me. Lucas's head lifted instantly, hope returning like a light switch. Daniel raised one eyebrow with quiet interest. Emily smiled gently at the boy's excitement. And I have never actually seen that dinosaur skeleton. Lucas grinned so widely it looked like the best birthday surprise of the entire night had just arrived. Lucas Whitmore practically bounced in his seat as the words settled into the air. Monday's work, he repeated, as if confirming the sentence might disappear if no one acknowledged it quickly enough. Emily Carter laughed softly at his enthusiasm, but she also noticed the way Daniel Whitmore watched the conversation unfold with quiet composure rather than pushing it forward. That calm patience had been there all evening. It was the same calm that had appeared when the earlier moment in the restaurant had started to unfold. Daniel nodded slowly. Monday works for us, he said. Lucas looked between them as if the entire plan had just been approved by some invisible council. This is perfect, he declared proudly. Emily rested one hand lightly against the back of the booth again, still smiling at the child's excitement. I should warn you, she said playfully. I have not been to the Science Museum since I was a kid. Lucas leaned forward immediately. That means you forgot all the best parts. Emily raised an eyebrow. All the best parts. Lucas nodded seriously. Yes, like the dinosaur bones and the giant spinning tornado machine and the space capsule. Emily glanced at Daniel with amused curiosity. That does sound like a very full schedule. Daniel shrugged slightly. Lucas tends to plan museum visits with military precision. Lucas lifted his chin proudly. Because museums are important. Emily laughed again, the sound easy and genuine. Around them the restaurant had continued its steady flow of evening guests, but the small moment at the booth had turned into something unexpectedly warm. Daniel looked at her for a second longer than necessary, noticing again the same quality that had caught his attention earlier. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply present in the conversation. That alone made her stand out. Emily finally stepped back from the booth slightly. I should probably return to my other tables before someone starts wondering where their water refill went, she said gently. Lucas nodded quickly but pointed at her with a fork like someone confirming a contract. Monday, he said firmly. Emily gave him a small nod in return. Monday. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple business card. It was understated, clean, with his name and a phone number printed in quiet silver lettering. He placed it lightly on the table near Emily. Just send a message when your shift schedule is clear, he said calmly. We will make a plan that works. Emily glanced down at the card and then back at him. She recognized the name immediately now. Whitmore Technologies was not exactly a small company in Chicago. For a brief second, she wondered if she should react differently. But the man sitting across from her had spent the entire evening behaving like an ordinary father sharing dinner with his son. She decided that was the version of him she preferred. Emily picked up the card and tucked it carefully into the pocket of her apron. All right, she said simply. Lucas looked extremely satisfied with the outcome. See, he said to his father, that worked. Daniel leaned back in the booth again with mild amusement. Apparently it did. Emily glanced toward the kitchen again as another order bell sounded softly. The restaurant was still busy and her shift was far from over. But as she stepped away from the Whitmore table, she felt something unusual. Most work shifts ended with the same predictable routine. Clear the tables, refill the drinks, finish the night. Tonight felt slightly different. At the booth, Lucas had already begun describing the dinosaur skeleton in enthusiastic detail, while Daniel listened with quiet patience. Emily moved between other tables again, delivering plates, refilling glasses, and checking on guests. Yet once or twice her attention drifted briefly back toward the window booth. Lucas eventually slid out of the seat and stretched his arms as if the entire birthday celebration had finally caught up with him. Dad, he said, this was the best birthday dinner ever. Daniel looked at him with a calm smile. I think it might be. Lucas glanced across the dining room toward Emily again. Because superheroes showed up. Daniel followed his gaze once more. Emily was laughing with another table now, her calm presence blending naturally into the rhythm of the restaurant again. Daniel had spent decades building a world where everything moved quickly, where people measured success in numbers and strategies. Yet tonight something simple had interrupted that pace. A waitress who stayed calm when others might panic. A small birthday cake with a candle. And a conversation that had somehow turned an ordinary dinner into the beginning of something unexpected. Lucas leaned against the booth again with a sleepy smile. Do you think she is excited for Monday too? He asked quietly. Daniel watched Emily for another moment before answering. I think, he said thoughtfully, she might be curious. Lucas nodded as if curiosity was already the first step of every good adventure. Emily Carter's shift continued long after the Whitmore booth finally grew quiet. New guests arrived. Orders moved quickly through the kitchen, and the restaurant lights softened as the evening slowly leaned toward closing time. Yet every once in a while, as she passed the window booth to check on other tables, she noticed Lucas Whitmore still watching the room with that curious expression children often carried when something new had entered their world. Daniel Whitmore remained seated across from him, calm as ever, his posture relaxed in a way that rarely happened outside of private moments with his son. Lucas eventually finished the last sip of his apple juice and leaned back in the booth with a tired but satisfied sigh. Dad, he said quietly, I think this birthday is officially legendary. Daniel smiled slightly at the word. Legendary is a strong term. Lucas nodded firmly. Cake, dinosaurs coming on Monday, and a superhero waitress. That is definitely legendary. Daniel glanced toward the other side of the restaurant again, where Emily was helping another table organize takeout boxes. Her movements remained steady and patient even after hours of work. He had seen many people manage pressure in different ways over the years. Some rushed. Some became loud. Some avoided responsibility entirely. But Emily Carter had done something different earlier. She had simply stayed calm. And calm had solved the situation faster than anything else. Lucas rested his chin on his folded arms on the table. "Do you think she believed us about the dinosaurs?" he asked. Daniel nodded slowly. "I think she believed you." Lucas seemed satisfied by that answer. A few minutes later, Emily returned once more to the Whitmore booth carrying a small glass container with wrapped mints inside. "End of dinner tradition," she said, placing the container in the center of the table. Lucas picked one immediately and examined the wrapper like it was a rare discovery. "Is this the official closing ceremony?" he asked. Emily laughed softly. "Something like that." Daniel reached for one as well and gave a quiet nod of appreciation. "Thank you." Emily glanced toward the window where the Chicago skyline shimmered softly across the river. "Looks like the evening stayed nice outside," she said casually. Lucas turned to look as well, pressing his hands lightly against the glass. "The city lights look like stars," he said quietly. Daniel watched his son for a moment before looking back at Emily. "He likes moments like this," he said. "Small adventures." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the small ones are the best." Lucas turned back from the window and looked at her again. "Monday will be a big adventure, though," he said confidently. Emily smiled at the boy's determination. "Then I suppose I should prepare myself for the dinosaur expert tour." Lucas sat up proudly. "I know all the facts." Daniel chuckled softly under his breath. Emily rested one hand lightly against the booth again for a second. "Well then," she said, "I will rely on you as my guide." Lucas nodded seriously, as if the responsibility had just become official. A manager near the kitchen entrance called Emily's name softly from across the room. She glanced back and gave a quick nod before returning her attention to the table. "I should probably finish a few closing tasks," she said. "But it was really nice meeting both of you tonight." Daniel stood slowly from the booth, placing a hand gently on Lucas's shoulder as the boy slid out beside him. "The pleasure was ours," he said calmly. Lucas looked up at Emily one more time before stepping away from the table. "Do not forget Monday," he said. Emily smiled warmly. "I will not." Daniel reached for his jacket and draped it over one arm as they prepared to leave. For a moment he hesitated, glancing back across the restaurant at the quiet space where the evening had started. Business meetings, company milestones, and expensive events often blurred together in his memory. Yet something about this simple dinner stood out more clearly than many of those larger moments. A calm waitress who handled a tense situation without drama. A birthday candle flickering over chocolate cake. And a small invitation that had somehow turned into a future plan. Lucas grabbed his father's hand as they walked toward the front door. "Dad," he said quietly, "I think Monday will be even better." Daniel looked down at him with a thoughtful smile. "It might be." Outside the restaurant, the Chicago air carried the cool breeze of the river as the city lights reflected across the water. Behind them, Riverside Grill continued its evening routine, unaware that one quiet birthday dinner had just changed the direction of several ordinary lives in ways none of them fully expected yet. Monday morning arrived with the quiet brightness of a Chicago day that promised clear skies and cool air coming off the river. Daniel Whitmore stood near the entrance of the Museum of Science and Industry, one hand resting lightly on Lucas Whitmore's shoulder while the boy bounced with excitement that had clearly started long before breakfast. Lucas had been awake before sunrise, reminding his father at least 6 times that dinosaurs did not wait for anyone who arrived late. Now he stood staring up at the massive stone building like it was the entrance to an entirely new world. "Dad," Lucas said quietly but urgently, "what if she gets here before us?" Daniel checked his watch calmly. "Then she will discover the dinosaurs without your official tour." Lucas gasped at the idea and immediately grabbed his father's hand. "We should go inside and wait." Daniel smiled faintly and allowed himself to be pulled toward the entrance doors. The museum lobby was already alive with the sounds of visitors exploring exhibits, families gathering, maps, and children pointing excitedly at displays. Lucas spun slowly in the middle of the wide marble floor, trying to decide which direction contained the most important discoveries. "She will probably like the tornado machine," he said thoughtfully. Daniel nodded. That seems likely. Meanwhile, across the street, Emily Carter stood on the corner, adjusting the strap of her small bag while studying the museum building. She had finished her morning coffee 20 minutes earlier, but still felt a small flutter of nervous curiosity in her chest. Meeting customers outside the restaurant was not something she normally did. Yet the invitation had felt sincere, and the thought of exploring the museum again after so many years had quietly appealed to her. She crossed the street and stepped through the museum entrance just as Lucas spotted her from across the lobby. She is here, he shouted happily, waving both arms like someone guiding an airplane. Several nearby visitors glanced over with amused smiles as Emily walked toward them. Good morning, she said warmly. Lucas nodded enthusiastically. You made it. Daniel greeted her with the same calm presence he had carried during dinner. I hope the schedule worked out. Emily nodded. Monday mornings are usually my quietest time. Lucas immediately stepped between them like an official guide beginning a tour. We have a lot to see, he announced. Emily raised an eyebrow playfully. I suspected that might be the case. Lucas pointed down the main corridor. Dinosaurs first. Daniel followed beside them as Lucas marched forward with determined enthusiasm. The museum hall opened into a massive exhibit space where the towering skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus rex stretched nearly 40 feet from nose to tail. Lucas stopped in the center of the room and spread his arms dramatically. This, he said proudly, is the best part. Emily looked up at the enormous fossil structure and let out a quiet laugh of amazement. You were not exaggerating. Lucas placed his hands on his hips like a professional curator. That is Sue the dinosaur, he explained. She lived 67 million years ago. Emily glanced at Daniel with amused admiration. He really does know the facts. Daniel nodded calmly. Museum visits are serious business. Lucas continued his tour with enthusiastic detail, explaining fossils, pointing out bones, and describing prehistoric life with a level of excitement that turned the exhibit hall into his personal classroom. Emily listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that encouraged Lucas to explain even more. Daniel watched the two of them interact with quiet interest. The same calm presence Emily carried in the restaurant seemed perfectly natural here as well. She asked thoughtful questions, laughed at Lucas's dramatic explanations, and treated the entire adventure like something genuinely fun rather than a polite favor. After a while, Lucas ran ahead toward another display where a rotating weather exhibit demonstrated the formation of tornadoes inside a tall glass chamber. Emily and Daniel slowed their pace slightly as they followed behind him. Thank you for inviting me, Emily said after a moment. Daniel glanced toward Lucas, who was already pressing buttons on the exhibit with delighted concentration. He has been talking about this museum all week, Daniel replied. Emily smiled softly. I can see why. For a moment, they stood quietly watching Lucas laugh as the swirling air column formed inside the glass tower. Daniel noticed something he had not experienced in a long time. The day felt simple. No schedules. No negotiations. Just a museum visit with a curious child and a woman who seemed perfectly comfortable sharing the moment. Emily folded her arms lightly as she watched Lucas continue experimenting with the exhibit controls. He is a good kid, she said gently. Daniel nodded once. He is the best part of my world. Lucas suddenly turned back toward them with a bright grin. Come on, he called. The space capsule is next. Emily laughed softly and started walking again beside Daniel Whitmore, both of them following the excited guide, who had already decided that the rest of the museum was waiting for them to explore it together. Lucas Whitmore had already moved ahead toward the space exploration wing before Daniel Whitmore and Emily Carter fully caught up with him. The wide hall of the museum echoed softly with excited voices and the hum of interactive displays. But Lucas moved through it with the confidence of someone who had decided the entire building existed for one purpose. Discovery. Over here, he called, waving his arms again as if guiding explorers toward a landing site. Emily followed beside Daniel, glancing around the exhibit hall with growing curiosity. Large photographs of astronauts covered the walls, and a full-scale model of a command module rested beneath bright lights in the center of the room. I forgot how impressive museums can be, she said quietly. Daniel watched Lucas climb onto a small platform where visitors could look inside a recreated space capsule cockpit. They tend to remind people how big the world really is, he he replied. Emily smiled slightly at the thought. Lucas leaned over the edge of the platform and motioned for them to join him. This is where the astronauts sit, he explained with intense seriousness as they stepped closer. Emily leaned forward to look inside the small capsule replica. Buttons and switches covered the control panel like a puzzle waiting to be solved. That looks complicated, she said. Lucas nodded. You have to train for years. Daniel rested one hand lightly on the railing beside the display. He has been researching astronaut training since last winter. Emily raised her eyebrows. That is impressive dedication. Lucas beamed proudly before jumping down from the platform and leading them toward the next section of the exhibit. The museum visit continued that way for the next hour. Lucas explained exhibits, asked questions, and occasionally paused long enough for Emily to share a memory of something she remembered from childhood visits. Daniel noticed how naturally the conversation flowed between them. Emily did not simply listen to Lucas out of politeness. She engaged with his curiosity, encouraging him to explain more and asking questions that made him feel like his knowledge mattered. Eventually, the three of them reached a quieter observation balcony overlooking the lake beyond the museum grounds. Sunlight reflected off the water in gentle waves, and a soft breeze moved through the open windows of the building. Lucas leaned against the railing, momentarily quiet after so much excitement. This place is huge, he said. Emily stood beside him and looked out across the lake. It really is. Daniel watched the two of them together with a thoughtful expression. In the past few hours, something had become increasingly clear. Emily's calm presence was not limited to the restaurant. She carried that same grounded energy everywhere she went. Lucas suddenly turned toward her with another question. Why did you start working at the restaurant? He asked curiously. Emily considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. It helped pay for school, she said. Daniel glanced toward her with mild surprise. What did you study? Emily rested her hands lightly on the railing beside Lucas. Education, she said. I always liked the idea of helping people learn things. Lucas grinned immediately. You are already good at that. Emily laughed softly. I think you were doing most of the teaching today. Daniel studied her expression carefully again. Do you still plan to work in education? He asked. Emily nodded slowly. Eventually. I just needed time to figure things out. Lucas looked between them thoughtfully before announcing something with complete certainty. You should definitely be a teacher, he said. Emily smiled warmly at the comment. That is a strong recommendation. Lucas crossed his arms like an expert evaluator. I know what I am talking about. Daniel chuckled quietly. The simple confidence of children had a way of cutting through complicated conversations. For a moment, the three of them stood there together looking out across the lake, the quiet breeze carrying the sound of distant city traffic. Emily finally glanced toward Daniel again. Thank you for today, she said gently. I had forgotten how much fun places like this can be. Daniel nodded once. Lucas and I enjoy sharing them with new people. Lucas looked at both of them and then back at the lake as if considering something important. We should do this again, he said. Emily laughed softly. Another museum mission. Lucas shook his head. Maybe the planetarium next time. Daniel met Emily's eyes for a brief second. There was no pressure in the moment, just a shared understanding that something simple had begun to grow from a random evening at a restaurant. Emily nodded thoughtfully. The planetarium does sound interesting. Lucas clapped his hands once with quiet excitement, as if the next adventure had already been approved. And as the sunlight moved slowly across the lake beyond the museum windows, none of them realized how much that ordinary Monday morning had already begun changing the direction of their lives. The afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the museum windows as the three of them stood together on the balcony overlooking Lake Michigan. For a while, none of them spoke. The water moved gently beneath the bright sky, and the distant skyline of Chicago stretched across the horizon like a quiet reminder that the world outside the museum was still moving at its usual fast pace. Lucas Whitmore rested his arms on the railing and sighed in a satisfied way that only children could manage after a day filled with discoveries. Today was better than my birthday, he said finally. Emily Carter laughed softly beside him. That is a bold statement. Lucas nodded with complete seriousness. Dinosaurs, astronauts, tornado machines, and planning the planetarium. That is definitely better. Daniel Whitmore stood a step behind them, watching the reflection of sunlight dance across the water. For a man whose life usually revolved around meetings, negotiations, and fast decisions, the quiet rhythm of the day felt surprisingly rare. He looked toward Emily for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for joining us today," he said calmly. Emily turned slightly toward him. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied. "I had forgotten how much fun learning can be when you are not rushing through everything." Lucas turned around and looked between them like a small scientist studying an interesting experiment. "You two should hang out more," he said confidently. Emily raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a professional recommendation." Lucas crossed his arms again in his familiar evaluator pose. "It is." Daniel chuckled quietly. Lucas tends to be very decisive about these matters. Emily leaned lightly against the railing and looked out at the lake again. The breeze moved gently through her hair, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply enjoy the calm. A few days earlier she had been serving tables at Riverside Grill, expecting another ordinary shift. Now she was standing beside a billionaire and his son at one of Chicago's most famous museums, planning future adventures. Life had a strange sense of timing sometimes. Lucas suddenly pointed toward the far end of the balcony where a small telescope allowed visitors to look across the lake. "Last stop," he announced. Emily laughed again. "The official closing exhibit." Lucas ran ahead toward the telescope while Daniel and Emily followed at a slower pace. When they reached the viewing station, Lucas stepped aside and motioned for Emily to look first. "You are the guest," he said politely. Emily leaned down and adjusted the telescope lens carefully. The lake stretched endlessly across the horizon, sunlight glittering across the water like thousands of tiny stars. "That is beautiful," she said softly. Lucas nodded proudly as if he personally owned the view. Daniel stood beside them quietly. Then after a moment he spoke again, his voice calm but thoughtful. "Emily," he said, "would you like to have dinner with me sometime? Just the two of us." The question was simple, but it carried the same sincerity he had shown since the evening they first met. Emily straightened from the telescope slowly and looked at him. There was no pressure in his expression, no expectation, just a quiet invitation. Lucas watched both of them carefully for a second before smiling like someone who had already predicted the outcome. Emily took a small breath and then smiled back at Daniel. "Yes," she said gently. Lucas threw both arms in the air like a championship victory had just been announced. "I knew it," he shouted happily. Daniel laughed quietly and shook his head. "Apparently my son is very confident in his predictions." Emily laughed with them, the sound light and genuine. For the first time that day, she realized something important. The invitation had not felt like a grand gesture or an impressive display of wealth. It had simply felt natural. Lucas leaned against the railing again, looking out across the lake as if the future was already unfolding in front of him. "This is the best science trip ever," he said proudly. Daniel placed a hand gently on his son's shoulder while standing beside Emily, both of them watching the sunlight slowly drift across the water. Somewhere in the distance a boat moved quietly along the horizon, leaving a gentle line behind it across the lake. And in that quiet moment the three of them understood something simple but powerful. Sometimes the most important changes in life did not begin with grand plans or dramatic moments. Sometimes they began with a calm waitress carrying a tray, a birthday cake with a single candle, and a small act of courage that no one expected. Because the quiet ones are never truly ordinary. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves touching stories, and subscribe to Love After Everything channel for more powerful moments like this. Your support helps us continue bringing inspiring stories about kindness, courage, and unexpected connections. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story that might change the way you see the world.